Dune Prophecy is not at all about Paul Atreides or this traditional story you might be familiar with from Dune Media or the first book in Frank Herbert's series, meant to be sort of an origin story for the Bene Gesserit, and it's based off of the work of Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, The Sisterhood of Dune. Notably, it's not intended as an adaptation of this book either, more like The Sisterhood of Dune is a jumping off point and we're telling a story that's sort of in between. This particular series is happening 10,000 years before Paul Atreides ever stepped foot on Arrakis. And because this is so close to the Bene Gesserit's founding, they're still figuring out all the different weirding ways and techniques that we see play a role in Paul Atreides' training. It seems like the Bene Gesserit aren't so much trying to get their foot in the door of the Empire so much as to secure that grasp they've already had. This story was also sort of interesting to me because it's told from the perspective of Valia Harkonnen, and if we look at most traditional Dune media, the Atreides clan is who we're following as like the heroes or the good guys, with the Harkonnens always being their enemies. It also immediately makes me suspicious of Valia's motives. In the Dune universe as I've experienced it, no one here is good, but there definitely are characters that are more evil. And I would say the Harkonnens are probably like the embodiment of everything that could go wrong. So it was really hard for me to go into this giving Valia a clean slate and sort of like trusting her and assuming that she was innocent and that other people were doing wrong to her. But I did give it the good college try here. Which rolls me right into general impressions about the series. I did not expect to like it. I was immediately drawn in by the acting, by the scenery, by the music, by the camera movement. Pleasant surprise. I thought there was some really strong color work going on in the design and the clothing. I don't always know what the colors are meant to be signifying or telling me, but I did notice that at specific times there were blocks of color here that seemed to have meaning, at least to the people within the world. And even if no viewer ever fully grasps or understands what those characters were signaling to each other, the fact that the world felt real enough that I could buy into the illusion these are characters living someplace and having conversations with each other and not just projecting things to the viewer is like a huge positive to me. I also really liked how each planet was depicted. We start on the Harkonnen home planet, which is like this frozen ice tundra. Very interesting to see that Valia has come out of such hardship, and also it was pretty interesting to me because I don't think this is the same Harkonnen home planet that we see in Dune. So they must have either gotten promoted or moved planets or something along the way, because the Harkonnen home world is described as like this harsh, chemical, heavily industrialized, polluted world. I thought too hot, not cold. And like they had all these coliseums and fighting rings and stuff in the Harkonnen homeworld in Dune proper. So something has gone on in the 10,000 years where they start on this ice world. And I liked that touch because it gave me this idea of like movement throughout time and a couple of things changing, even if like all the noble houses are the same and the structure is the same and all these other things remain neutral. It's like the politicking back and forth and the fighting for power between noble houses that make like major changes. And you're gonna get those observations based off of which planets people are occupying and the state of those planets. We also get to see the Atreides homeworld, and it's like this lush, forested world. It seems like these people are naturally in tune with the environment and happy about it instead of sort of like fighting against it and struggling to like scratch out a living. And I liked this because in Dune proper, the Atreides line is like described as a noble house that's very populous, it's fair to its people, its planet is temperate. They've sort of balanced their economy with the environment so the planet is thriving and doing well along with its people. And I can sort of imagine like this forested world the way it is now, like evolving with the people and being maintained. I don't know for certain if this is the same homeworld or if the Atreides have swapped homeworlds throughout their history as well, but it's believable to me that they have this nicer land than the Harkonnens, they took better care of it, and they got to maintain it 10,000 years down the road. And then we swap over to the Emperor's home planet, which is Salutis Secundus, and we know in 10,000 years that is a desolate wasteland of a planet that's used as a prison planet where the Sardaukar get trained, which is like the most intense and lethal security the Emperor has. So we have to assume that the Emperor himself is quite wasteful, doesn't make good use of his resources, and like these industrialized, more modernized areas we see at the capital sort of eventually destroy and overcome the planet and force everyone to move off of it, which to me was sort of cool because Dune universe has always been a little bit about environmentalism and being a good steward to the land, so having this kind of like reference this lesson here 10,000 years down the line is like a fun little story. And of course, I love that the Bene Gesserit planet is sort of like austere, devoid of distraction, almost sort of like serene and sterile in its landscape. Something I felt like Dune Prophecy was missing was like a little bit more incorporation of spice. I guess it's possible that we're a little early in the timeline for humanity to understand exactly how important spice is and all of its different uses. Counter argument to that, if we're across different planets, the Spacers Guild is a thing. And the Spacers Guild uses this spice, trades in spice, all that kind of stuff. So like minimally, it should be known that it's a huge currency. And if they're interacting on Dune / Arrakis, then they've met Freeman, and spice is a huge part of their diet and culture too, so they should have like picked some of that up. Regardless, there is like an interesting level of drug usage, and I sort of interpreted that as different versions of spice, even though that's not necessarily true. At one point in time, they're doing some kind of vaping drug, and I thought they'd like aerialize the spice. They're doing a lot of sort of cocaine-like gestures, and I thought that was, again, spice, even though it wasn't the right color. I could be wrong, but it does seem like nobles and people who are aspiring to that sort of position are the ones who are using the spice. And spice is definitely something that is reserved for those of higher standings. It's supposed to like clarify your memory. It's supposed to give you a slightly euphoric feel. In large enough quantities, it's supposed to change you physically, and it's also supposed to have like healing properties and longevity properties. The spice does a lot of things, and there are a lot of good ways to incorporate it into their society. So if these drug uses were examples of different ways they're experimenting with spice, I think that's sort of like a good start. If they could clarify its spice, if they could give it that like distinctive color we're familiar with, that would go a long way to helping me personally. I would have liked more ceremonial use of it. Here in like Western culture, we sort of understand the party scene, the binge scene, the abusive use of drugs. But as far as like the more ceremonial, purpose-driven to like evolve humanity or to bring out hidden talents, as the spice is sort of known to do, like that drug in Limitless, I would have liked if we had taken a closer examination of what the procedure would have been to do that, what the specific setting and scenario would have been to make that happen. Certainly the Space Guilders, the Bene Gesserit, and I believe the Mentax and maybe even the Sug School all use spice to like bring out the highest capability in humanity. I have to assume that they do this in different ways with different ceremonies, experimentations, because they have different end results. And we are sitting here with the founding of the Bene Gesserit, so I would have liked like a little bit more about the spice use, at least with the Bene Gesserit. Could have at least seen the spice, maybe seen people skimming some off the top and explaining why they liked it or what it did for them, or even just shown them using it and then seeing like these sort of superhuman results. All the acting and directing felt really on point and engaging. I believe the characters were who they said they were. It felt like they had a consistent motivation and journey throughout the show. I didn't feel like anyone was just hanging out to be a plot point or doing things to move the story along. It seemed like they had these deep internal motivations and desires, and they were acting on them and responding to the situation as things change. Really great for like political intrigue. I found the first 9 minutes of episode 1 was a huge exposition dump, and by that I mean they're like establishing a machine war that happened that created like this diaspora of people and led to this rule about no thinking machines, and like the Bene Gesserit are like a branch of truth-sayers that existed there in the war, and the Atreides were like the victors of the war, but secretly they're keeping information back about the Harkonnens because they were allies and not traitors. There's good visuals to go with it, there's good acting, like it's engaging enough, but it was like at the 9-minute mark before I was like, okay, here's my inciting incident. This is probably where we should have started. If you are new to the Dune series, it's gonna be a lot to take in episode 1. And what I would recommend is Valia's got 2 quotes that I used as like my grounding principles along with Dorothea's 1 comeback. And those are gonna be the ways that we personally explore the show. And from this point on, there will probably be spoilers. If you haven't watched it and you intend to watch it, I would keep track of these 3 quotes. Quote number 1, victory is celebrated in the light, but it is one in shadow. Number 2, what holds more truth, history or prophecy. And number 3, thou shalt not disfigure the human soul. And let's start with victory is celebrated in the light, but it is won in the darkness. This struck me because it felt like this might have been the pitch for Star Trek's recent Section 31 movie, except Section 31 wants to make this rotting thesis like bright, fun, colorful misfits instead of the more dark, disturbing material it's always intended to be. And that's why I think this kind of premise belongs way more in the Dune universe, where everyone is kind of bad and nefarious, than it does in sort of like a shiny Star Trek kind of vibe. Dune is still a capitalist scarcity environment, so proposing the idea that you might have to do bad things for good ends because there's limited resources has merit, and there is not a democratic or really merit-based way for you to socially climb in the Dune universe. Like, if you're born a poor nobody, you're pretty much gonna stay that poor nobody vassal all your life. I suppose it's possible that you could rise in the ranks of the military, that you could join the Sook school, the Bene Gesserit school, or the Mentak school. Even if you are talented and if you are trying your best and doing all the things, none of that is a guarantee that any of that will work out in your favor. And even if you do rise in the ranks through those schools, you will still be tied to the loyalty and vassaldom of whatever noble you've been assigned to. This is a society that has technology but has put a cap on certain kinds of technology, and also has sort of lost some of the history on how or why certain things work certain ways. Because they have this rule against thinking machines, they're limited by what a human's capacity is, and they're always pushing the bounds of what that is. And one of the key ways they investigate the brink of humanity is through suffering and torment, where they think they discover new ways to fight adversity. Which kind of sets up this world that like requires cruelty for evolution, and in which there's no like peaceful way to challenge power. So Valia is pretty much just telling us up front that she is not a good guy, and that her plan is not the good plan, which, you know, accurate and appropriate for a Harkonnen protagonist. If we're repulsed or squeamish, that is in effect because we should be. Her argument is that the evil is done out of necessity, and that we wouldn't have the good results we're so proud of without her dark work. So as a viewer, we've got to ask, are Valia's actions actually necessary? And if not, is this due to Valia's poor planning? Or is this telling us that like evil acts can never lead to good end? And cards on the table, I think this statement is bullshit right off the bat. I do think the Dune universe is the best place to explore it because it creates greatest opportunity for this to be a true statement. But it does strike me as something a guilty person says to cope with the atrocities they committed. It's sort of like them rewriting themselves as the harsh but necessary hero, and those who reject that premise are just like the hapless idiots who don't understand. And this actually kind of had me relaxing into the story because the opening tells me I'm not gonna like these people, and that's okay. That means I don't have to care about the outcome. I can just watch it and consume it without like all this moral trivializing one way or the other. I'm never gonna understand what motivates these characters. I'm always gonna be repulsed by them, and that's fine. It means I don't have to waste energy trying to figure it out. I don't have to evaluate whether or not their solution makes any sense, and neither does anyone else, because that's not the point of the story we're telling. But if you are more open to this possible premise, it would invite you to see the humanity in bad people. It might help you realize we all want the same thing and are going about it in different ways. And I'd say if you accept this premise at the top, whether Valia's plan succeeds or fails is actually quite important, because if her breeding program actually does bring about a better ruler, more stability, and better living for the Empire, means that maybe that horrible action she took and all of that manipulation like paid off to good things for a larger group of people. But if she goes through this breeding program and has nothing to show for it, then we can just say this was a bad action, it was a stupid idea, and it failed and was destined to fail from the start. And there is a time I could have been in this latter group and sort of been open to this premise, but I am just tired at this point in time. I cannot see Valia as some kind of misguided queen or some sort of world where this plan makes sense or is good. The best I can do do for Valia is acknowledge that people were terrible to her as a child in ways that don't feel like had good explanation and reasoning, like she does have a traumatic past. And while it sort of seems like she has this vanity and this aspiration the rest of her family doesn't have, the fact of the matter is somebody in her family told her that the Harkonnens did a good thing in the war and that the Atreides had lied about them and like banished them to this ice world. And I have to ask, like, what was the purpose of telling her this story if it wasn't to try and like regain glory for the Harkonnens? You know, when you decide to tell your child an alternate history, they have to figure out what to do with that information. And if you're not there prepared to lead and guide them, maybe don't do that. I am a little bit curious to learn exactly how Valia had gained like the leadership and the loyalty of her brother and her sister. They don't really go over that in this season. I guess they could all just have been raised under these harsh conditions, and Valia is the one with the natural leadership, so everyone kind of fell in line. Valia also possesses this thing called the voice, where she can command people to do things, and I wonder if perhaps she did this at a young age, and it's that kind of subtle exertion has the other two children following her. And that's something we don't fully explore in Dune Prophecy that I hope we do get to see a little bit in a season 2, but if you have some kind of power like the voice, where you can tell people what to do or what to feel or like what to remember or think, then you always have to sort of be questioning how people are responding to you. Especially because I think in early days, Valia wasn't aware of this power. It wasn't until she went to Bene Gesserit training and her and Raquel sort of like talked it out, and then she sort of like practiced a little bit more that she knew when she was or wasn't consciously using the voice. So you have to like reflect on your childhood and wonder if you were subconsciously using it or if you're using it at like a lower level than the straight order version is. And that sort of like rewrites your own story and makes you wonder if you're manipulating people or not, and it probably makes other people wonder if you're always constantly manipulating them to get certain kinds of reactions or emotions from them too, which has gotta take its own sort of toll. So I can recognize Valia a little bit as like a flawed and suffering character, even if I can't see like the nobility in her plan or sacrifices. And also, to be perfectly fair to Valia, the plan that she's looking to execute is not her plan. Really, Valia is out here trying to push the plan of Mother Superior Raquel, who was sort of like her second mother figure, her mentor, and like a woman who on her deathbed left Valia with a charge to fulfill her work and to keep the sisterhood together. And as Raquel was the first and perhaps the only adult that ever seemed to take interest in Valia as herself and seemed to like praise her unique traits instead of putting her down, I do have to wonder if Valia is picking up this mantle because she wants to, or if she's doing this out of some kind of loyalty. Of course, we can counter argue all of this by saying that Raquel's plan really plays into Valia's ambitions and her personal strengths, so she could have been 100% willing. Also, if Raquel left her with this charge or this duty, it gives her the right to overthrow Dorothea and to do whatever she has to do to achieve this goal and to seize power, permission that she's been waiting for all of her life. As far as what the Bene Gesserit are actually doing, it's pretty much the same thing they're doing in Dune, which is doing a secret breeding program while being truth-sayers for nobles and manipulating them to their own ends to be part of this breeding program experiment. And obviously eugenics is wrong, so the whole premise is faulty. And obviously it's wrong to manipulate people. But the flip side of this is that all of the nobles and people the Bene Gesserit are manipulating are terrible, awful people. So it's hard to feel too bad about it. And while we have examples of the Bene Gesserit being able to exert a lot of influence over the nobles, we also have moments where they disobey the Bene Gesserit as well. For example, the Emperor does cast Valia out of the castle and say she's no longer welcome there. You know, for all of her scheming, all of her manipulation, the fact they were about to send his daughter to her school, she still can't seal the deal and 100% control or manipulate the man. They do have free will, and to a certain degree, the Emperor and any of the other nobles in the houses listening to these truth-sayers are the ones who are responsible for their own actions and decisions. I suppose potentially we could feel bad for the princess because she was like bred, raised, groomed, trained specifically for this one position. So I guess that technically makes her an innocent woman who's been manipulated from early childhood to do this one thing. She is the next in line to be Empress of the universe, and she is spoiled and petty and sometimes cruel for no apparent reason. And it's hard for me to waste time feeling bad for her or even to see her as anything more than just like entitled. I think the closest I come to feeling bad for any of the Bene Gesserit's victims is perhaps the resistance movement, because there is like a rebellion happening within the Empire, and we come to find out that there's a Bene Gesserit embedded in the rebellion movement as well, and it's been manipulating and moving those pieces the exact same way that they have been the nobles. So the Bene Gesserit are in some ways the most in control of the situation, because they have a rebellion on call ready to overthrow when they feel that will help them, or a rebellion they can throw under the bus to gain favor and power with the Emperor. The first thing we see where the Bene Gesserit are taking something outside of the scope of power and casting influence and warping it into a tool of their own. Even though I feel a little bad for the resistance movement, these rebels aren't just like freedom fighters or whatever. They are definitely terrorists with terroristic plans. Arguably, the quote at the top, "what we celebrate in the light is done in the darkness," is gonna apply to this rebellion as much as it does anything the Bene Gesserit plan. For me, the everybody sucks of it all kind of really softens any potential blow to like these nefarious goals, or if you even think what the Bene Gesserit are doing is that bad at all. Which leads us into the second quote: what holds more truth, history, or prophecy? This kind of strikes me as a weird question in the Dune universe. The Bene Gesserit themselves are not a religious order. They make up a lot of prophecies and use a lot of different religions across different universes to their own ends, but they don't actually fit in any one of these religions, and supposedly they don't believe any of them. As an order, they don't believe in prophecy, but they do have this thing called prescience, and they also have like a connection to their foremothers' information. And prescience is kind of like a prophecy in that it gives the individual insight into a moment down the line. But as we saw in Dune proper with Paul, the prescience can be very fickle. Like, all of it is true, but they're seeing a bunch of different potential outcomes depending on who does what when. So you can see something through prescience which is true, and it cannot come true because people have acted in the wrong way at the wrong time. And Paul, you know, has more prescience than other characters in the universe have had before, so he's able to figure out what actions to take when to get to like the good ending or whatever. Like here in Dune Prophecy, where we're 10,000 years in the past and probably still trying to figure all of this out, Raquella has this moment of prescience, and she warns both Valia and Dorothea about it on her deathbed. It makes sense for Dorothea to call this a prophecy because Dorothea is super religious, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for Valia to view it that way, and because as far as we know, this is the first instance of prophecy or prescience or whatever you want to call it within the order. There's no reason for Valia to automatically believe that this is a true, unalienable fact. And if it is true and unalienable, then I don't know why she's trying to prevent it or trying to drive towards it. It seems like this is going to happen no matter what. I don't know, at this point in time, I'm kind of leaning into the idea that the showrunners were having a hard time divorcing a sisterhood like the Bene Gesserit from any kind of religion. So that's how they like leaned into prophecy, and it's close enough to prescience that I should sort of like overlook the bad use of phrasing. It's also possible that the showrunners understood it, but they didn't know how they were going to depict that in 6 episodes to an audience, and they felt like combining this with piety and religion and faith was the way to go. It is a little bit weird because the Dune universe is about science and technology, and the reason that like psychic abilities have any presence in the Dune universe at all is because at the time Frank Herbert was writing, psychic abilities were sort of being investigated by science. So even though nowadays we think about like psychic powers and prescience and connecting to our foremothers' knowledge base as magic, at the time he was writing and exploring these ideas, this was like distinctly a scientific possibility. I'm a little disappointed that we're not getting more divorce from religion and divine influences and more lean into like the science of it all, but I understand why perhaps that was the way the showrunners decided to go. The problem with believing in history is of course a little bit more obvious to all viewers because we know that history is written by the victors and therefore we get their viewpoint of what things happen. We also know that not everything is recorded in history, like some people's lives weren't worth recording or some things were just such commonplace knowledge they didn't get recorded. There's like a lot of gaps and holes and gentle phrasing using in our modern history. So this is easy for us to pick up in like a fictional work as well. And thematically here, it's interesting in this story because Valia says that the Atreides lied about the Harkonnens' participation in the Machine Wars, and her brother tries to correct the record by talking to the Atreides and comes back dead. So even though we don't know exactly what the Atreides lied about, so we don't know if the Harkonnens and Atreides were allies and the Atreides decided to write them out of the story, or if the Harkonnens wanted to do something like very dark and grim and the Atreides stopped them and still managed to defeat the machines, or if this is just a lie that Valia is telling us, or that Valia's family has told us, and actually the truth is as history says it is. Because we don't have these specifics, we don't know what of these options, if any of them, it is, but it does give us this mutable, changing, shifting tides of story. And since this feud between the Atreides and the Harkonnens and how they understand the history of their alliance is sort of what kicks Valia off into the Bene Gesserit and like making the Bene Gesserit a thing, it seems like it's quite important. And in some ways I think that's more interesting in the Dune universe, that truth is not the end-all be-all. Lies, mistellings, miscommunications all can like change the fate of the world with just as much power and permanence is the truth. Which rolls me into thou shalt not disfigure the soul. So Dorothea shouts this as a rebuttal to Valia's attempt to rally the Bene Gesserit around her after Raquella's death. Valia is sort of talking about how there's going to be this great trial. It's very important the sisterhood stay together. They have to use all their power and all their strength and influence to maintain focus and to maintain their relevancy. We have to push everyone's boundaries and we have to do the best we can. Dorothea shouts out, thou shalt not disfigure the human soul. In context for the rest of the Bene Gesserit who don't know about the secret breeding program and the secret thinking machine computer that's underneath their compound, I feel like this quote is not very compelling or impactful. So that's kind of funny all on its own, but as an audience member, we do know that there's like a computer underneath there using forbidden technology to try and like manipulate people into breeding a better leader. So then we have to ask, what does Dorothea mean by thou shalt not disfigure the human soul? Is it the use of the thinking machine? Is it manipulating all those people? Is it the human breeding experiment? Is it all three of those she finds repulsive? And also we sort of have to ask what Dorothea means by the human soul. Dorothea does appear to be a religious person, even though the Bene Gesserit are not supposed to be religious, so perhaps she means it in like the traditional theological way. But like within the Dune universe, as I know it, I have to wonder if she's talking about consciousness, because the Bene Gesserit can go through something they call the agony, where they like poison themselves and gives them a ability to connect to their foremothers' knowledge, which implies that their foremothers, even after death, are like alive and kicking somewhere with full memory. Does using a thinking machine, doing all this kind of intense manipulation, doing like a breeding program somehow disfigure this consciousness? And if so, how? And here's a counterpoint. When a person goes through the agony, if they fail, that means the foremothers have sort of like taken them over and they can go into a comatose state and never wake back up. But they can also just not have a strong enough like personality or consciousness, and one of their foremothers can take over that body and sort of like take control. So I have to wonder if the comatose state and or a foremother taking over your body is a form of disfiguring the soul. And if so, does that mean that encouraging people to take part in the agony is also a form of disfiguring the human soul and therefore unholy? Or is it okay in that case because of all the knowledge you gain if you're successful? If using thinking machines can disfigure the human soul and there's no tangible proof of that or like any evidence we can point to. But over here with the agony, we can point to various ways the human soul like sort of collapses in on itself when put through these sort of rigors. It feels like both should be wrong or neither should be wrong. And also, mega spoilers, but Dorothea does come back in one of her ancestors, Lila. She undergoes the agony, she goes comatose, Tula keeps her body alive. At one point in time, Raquella possesses her. And then another point in time, Dorothea comes in and takes over. So isn't she disfiguring her granddaughter's soul when she comes in and takes over her body? Like, isn't she actively participating in the thing she says is evil and therefore a hypocrite? And overall, I think Dorothea is a really interesting character because she is Raquella's granddaughter. She's raised in the Bene Gesserit order, she's gone on missions, she spent years teaching the acolytes how to be sisters. She also hates everything that's Raquella hell is life work, even though she finds significant value in the Bene Gesserit order as a whole. So I do kind of like wonder what it's like from her perspective to think this thing her grandma built was great, but this other thing her grandma is using the Bene Gesserit for is pure evil. And if Dorothea is like a hardline conservative, piety, morality warrior, and she comes to find out that the Bene Gesserit are using an AI machine to do this breeding program, I have to wonder why she stayed with them, why she didn't reveal the truth, like what was going on there in her mind. And y'all might think I'm a huge Dorea fan because she's sort of like a whistleblower on this evil thing happening within the Bene Gesserit, but you should know right now I think she's completely loathsome. She's prejudiced against the Harkonnen line, judging Valia way before Valia's done anything even remotely nefarious within the Bene Gesserit. She's just like a sad, mourning child. She's so harsh, she often crosses the line into bullying and meanness. She's very conservative and tight-laced and unforgiving of differences. I think if she had been given full control of the Bene Gesserit, she would have been as ruthless and cutthroat as Valia is, just in a different direction. And I hate to keep reiterating this, but Dune is a magic-free universe, which means that Dorothea's adherence to religion is wrong. Her whole foundation for finding the eugenics breeding program to be immoral is wrong. You can believe the right thing for the wrong reason, and you can do the wrong thing for the right reason. And in some ways, I find Dorothea and Valia sort of like mirrors of each other in setup, at least, because Dorothea believes the right thing, that this program they're doing is wrong, but she believes that for the wrong reason. And Valia is doing an awful thing by trying to go through with this program, but she's doing it to create a better world, so I guess that's the right reason. And all this sort of rolls me into my reservations about Dune Prophecy. Mostly, is this the story we needed right now? I don't know if any of this stuff was intentional, but here's a lot of things I just couldn't overlook. Starting with eugenics. So the breeding program is based off the idea that each person's DNA will help create these sort of traits within these people, and then we can have the right person rule, and that person will create more stability and prosperity for everyone. Yay, yay. But the whole like genetic traits, nurture over nature, like this is bunk science, and it was used by the Nazis to do evil things. It was used to justify chattel slavery in the US. Like, we know this is wrong. Yes, nature gives us something in the makeup of what makes you human and what makes up your personality and what your strengths and weaknesses are. So does nurture. We're not 100% sure on how to balance that or how to give it certain attributes, but we do know that some of this overemphasis, like the idea that you could just breed yourself a better person, is not true. There's no like DNA unlocking that's going to make that happen for you. So for me, creating a show where the whole premise is we are going to breed our way to a better human and a gentler, fairer society is kind of dangerous on its face. I'm always kind of worried about like the Fight Club phenomena where the main character there is a bad dude but everyone is rooting for him. Or like a Breaking Bad scenario where for some reason, even though we're repeatedly shown that Walter White is terrible and abusive and cruel and willing to do anything, people still want him to survive. They still are rooting for his success. It's not enough that the character is complex and interesting and engaging. We have to like justify it in our minds and like moralize it in some kind of way that twists us into like rooting for the wrong things. And I certainly see the potential for that to happen here in Dune Prophecy as well, although to be fair to the show, it doesn't actively condone this breeding program or actually give us any indication that it's going to work. In fact, anyone who knows anything about the Dune universe knows that 10,000 years down the line, the Bene Gesserit breeding program is still happening. So like this precipice moment that Valia thinks she's at, about to succeed, is definitely not the case. I'd like the show to actually like speak to that a little bit more, or perhaps we'll see that in season 2. But as of right now, Valia is all in on this belief, and I really think seeing her disillusioned would go a long way to helping with this theme. The presence of AI and the smart machines, there's a lot going on with AI right now. And I really don't know that we needed one more piece of media about the machine wars nearly destroying humanity. And all of that leading us into like some kind of backward time for our survival. And then on top of everyone like swearing not to go past a certain level of technology, we come to find out that Bene Gesserit are using a thinking machine to like further their breeding program to make better humans, which I fucking hate when it's like the problem is AI and the solution is also AI. Again, I guess to be fair to Dune Prophecy, it doesn't say much one way or the other about these elements. there was a machine war in humanity's past in Dune, but it doesn't really explain if it was humans versus machines, if there were humans aligned with the machines. The fact that truthsayers were part of the fighting regiment against these machines sort of implies there must have been humans on the machine side, because why would you need a truthsayer to figure out if machines are telling you the truth? I don't know, I think the vagueness about this machine war is sort of like intentional, but it colors everything going forward, because based off of that war that humanity barely won, all these other factions sort of like broke off, took over the world, created a set of rules that are against thinking machines, and have created like the Sook School, the Bene Gesserit, the Mentats, because these are all different variations of humans sort of exploring maximum capacity of humanity and taking over the role of computers and thinking machines and various assets of day-to-day life. It's not so much that humanity didn't need these accommodations that thinking machines were providing, more that they're trying to get it from humanity in a more safe and controlled manner. But all that still circles me back to the whole thinking machines are AI. We're on sort of like a precipice with AI right now, and this hasn't really explored it in any kind of thoughtful, meaning way. It's just sort of haphazardly thrown in there as another ingredient in the sauce. I personally noticed an exploration of political conservatism and it sort of eating its own. It seems to me that pretty much everyone in the Dune universe is conservative, trying to conserve their power, trying to conserve their riches and influence, but also trying to like keep a certain way of living like locked in ice or whatever, because we're looking at an emperor system with noble houses where they're using swords, and yes, they like justify that by like the shields they have or whatever, but it seems like they have found more rules to keep things like locked at a medieval level than like finding ways to circumnavigate that. They've forbidden progressing technology past a certain point. They're forcing women to live in like a secondary role with men as leaders. It really is harkening back to like this more traditional way of living, traditional values scenario, and it's fucking awful. I don't remember where I heard this, but it's something that's always stuck with me, and it's like the major belief of a politically conservative person is that there's like the right people to rule, and in this case, the emperor believes he's the right person to rule, the head of each noble house believes they're the right person to rule, there's no upward mobility or other way to come into power. The Bene Gesserit think that all these people are powerful and corrupt, but they believe that they can literally breed the right person to rule. So they're all sort of like politically maneuvering and jockeying for this power and like doing sleight of hand to get around each other. At its core, they all believe there is a right person to rule, and if they put that person on the throne without changing anything else in their society, things would be better. And just with the state of where like United States politics are right now, and how it seems like a million things are happening and they're attempting to do a million different things that we don't know whether or not they're legal or not, no one's stopping to ask any questions, no one's putting any checks and balances. When the judicial branch gets involved and rules certain things down, those people come back with the idea that maybe the judicial branch doesn't actually have the power to check them the way we've empowered them historically. Like, it's a very uncertain time, very like conservative, grab power kind of feel already going on. I don't know that I needed more media like this in my diet at the moment. For me personally, I found watching the show, watching this political maneuvering, watching who these people were play out on screen like pretty demoralizing. And I think the single most heartbreaking point is actually in a flashback where young Tula is courting Ori Atreides. She has this moment of incredible vulnerability with him where she admits that she's been hiding the fact she's a Harkonnen, and she fully expects Ori to do what power has always done, which is to destroy her. And instead, Ori's like, hey, we are not our families, we don't have to continue to perpetuate the past into our present, we can make our own decisions, and I've decided that I love you. But it's already too late, because Tula poisoned Ola Atreides' line last night, and when Ori goes out and sees this is when she like takes the needle and stabs him, murdering him too. So the one person who even suggests change, or suggests that you could be the master of your own fate, you could have your own political upward mobility, gets killed by the conservatives. A close like second attempt to this might have been when Raquella on her deathbed was trying to bring Dorothea and Valia together to work as like a pair and co-lead. And honestly, I don't know what Raquella Raquel was thinking, because she had in no way prepared them for that. Like, she had sort of prepared each one of them to be the sole leader. And the whole structure of the Bene Gesserit leading up to this point was with like one person in charge making all the decisions, not a committee or a twofold operation. But like, that was never gonna work. And even though arguably Valio wins by murdering Dorothea, I think Dorothea would have done the same thing to Valia if she'd been able to get the jump on her first. And that speaks more to like these structures of power, how we have trained people to think, and how we have set up the game in and of itself, where there can only be one, and where we don't see like having opposing points of view and different perspectives as a strength instead of a weakness. And that kind of rolls me right into the fact that the interior rulings of the Bene Gesserit looks exactly like the structure of the Empire right now. The Bene Gesserit is a woman-led sisterhood group. It had a chance to look radically different than whatever was going on in the Empire. Arguably, it should, because the Bene Gesserit recognize that the Emperor and the noble houses are a bunch of selfish children fighting for power and like committing violence and unrest against its people. And their goal was to stabilize and improve everyone's quality of life. So like, if you know that what they're doing doesn't work, then why doesn't your structure look different? I don't know, maybe it was a lot for me to expect that a whole bunch of showrunners would sit down for 5 minutes and think about like a different way the Bene Gesserit could have been run. Also, there's just like a lot of violence against women and like very inherently sexist world in Dune that I find personally unpleasant. There's plenty of reasons to find the Dune world unpleasant. It's not a great place to be. It is standout to me the inherent level of violence and sexism in the show, because all the people in power except for the Bene Gesserit are men. And it seems like even if you're the princess, you know, born to be the ruler or whatever, you can't do that if you don't have a king. And even like in the case of Inez, when she marries a 9-year-old, part of the reason she does that is because he won't come of age for several years, so she'll get to rule solo in his stead. Which says to me that when he becomes king, even though he wasn't part of the ruling class house, he gets to be the next emperor and he gets to make all the decisions. Even in a society where bloodline rules, where you will have to be the right person to be the leader, that right person also has to be male, and that kind of sucks. And then if we look at the Bene Gesserit as a whole, like the stories of the various sisters there, all of them come from like slave trafficking, sexual violence, childhood trauma and violence. They have been extremely exploited. And the show Dune Prophecy is supposed to be about the Bene Gesserit and all female organization, leadership, power structure. So you would think that it would have engaged with this element of Dune a little bit more intensely than some of the others. Either like pushing back, trying to do something transformative, or do something at all. And it's not like the Bene Gesserit only have power by whispering in the ear of like the emperor or a noble house. They have something called the Voice, and we get to see Valia fighting with the Voice at the end of the last episode, and she takes out a ton of elite soldiers. She would have completely decimated the field if Desmond wasn't there. And even with her and Desmond facing off, Desmond having illegal technology that creates a unstoppable virus, they only lead to a stalemate, and Valia walks away from that fight, the first person to survive that virus. These women could be challenging the structure of power, could be creating a safe haven, could be doing something transformative and unique in the Dune universe. It just didn't feel like a fully formed, considered thought. And then last but not least, this is kind of just like a Debbie Downer of a show. Everyone and everything is bad. And I mean like evil, nefarious, not good for society, not like bad as in unenjoyable or done poorly. And sometimes while watching the show, it made everything feel very pointless because I wasn't rooting for everything. There was no one outcome I wanted to see or had any investment. From my perspective, anything and everything could happen in the show and I'd be like, sure, and just shoulder shrug and keep on going on. And in this perspective, it really doesn't help that this is a prequel show, because I know nothing is going to destroy the Bene Gesserit order. Nothing is going to destroy the Empire. No status quo elements will be changed when Paul Atreides enters the scene in 10,000 years. So like on a general level, I feel like the theming is very rich. But at the same time, Dune Prophecy just has all this stuff and it isn't saying much with it. The fact that it presents things and then specifically fails to explore it feels a little bit like a disservice. And that kind of rolls me into the plot, which is presumably the Tiran Arafal. This is the moment of prescience that Raquel has where she warns both Dorothea and Valia that something is coming to destroy the Bene Gesserit, and that would be the Tiran Arafal, or the Burning Truth as it's called. Now it's my personal opinion that neither Desmond or Lila are the Tiran Arafal, although you could make an argument that either or both of them are. And if either one of them are the Tiran Arafal, Arafal, it's kind of ironic because the very thing Raquella is trying to warn them against is what her warning perpetuated through the choices that Valia makes. But at the same time, I don't see Desmond being able to destroy the Bene Gesserit. It's understandable to me that after he kills the 9-year-old child that Valia had paired Inez up with, that she'd be upsetty spaghetti because that ruins her breeding program. But even if this thwarts the program, it doesn't destroy the Bene Gesserit as a whole. And Desmond has sort of shown himself at this point in time to be unstable enough that if Valia had just left that alone, I think he would have burned himself out. And Lila being possessed by Dorothea is a threat to Valia personally, but I don't see her as a threat to the Bene Gesserit either because she also wants to keep the Bene Gesserit going. Certainly Dorothea's rule would look different than Valia's. I think the Bene Gesserit would become more tools and less actively manipulative players in the Empire scene, which in some ways would probably ingratiate them more to the noble houses and make the order more likely to continue on. It would just look different, and certainly all of the framework would still be there when another Reverend Mother takes over with more ambition than Dorothea has. I don't know, I felt like it was sort of like a jangling key plot thread to sort of keep people interested if you couldn't follow all of the characters or other motivations going on. I think the 3 thematic elements I quoted up top are better things to track, but if all else fails, following the Tiran Arafal is definitely one way for you to interpret the show. So wrapping it all up, I think Dune Prophecy is a good show, and I think this is an interesting take on the Dune universe as a whole. The world building is fine, the character work is great, I think there is enough political intrigue and thematic elements being explored that it sort of honors what Frank Herbert most cared about when he wrote his stories, but it's clearly quite separate from his original work or even from his son's work in the Dune universe. I didn't personally have a lot of trouble getting into these 6 episodes, but I have read the Dune book before. I think maybe if you have no introduction to Dune at all, this might be a little hard to sink your teeth into, but most people have seen either a movie or read the book at this point. I'm not quite sure what brings you to the show if you don't have those previous introductions. But it is a Debbie Downer of a series that I think suffers both from a little bit of its thoughtless presentation of some of the themes and ideas it introduces, as well as releasing at a time that feels politically precarious for a lot of people in the US. That said, I am glad they're renewing it for season 2. To me, this first season with only 6 episodes feels a little bit undercooked and like it didn't come to a very solid conclusion. Storytelling wise, it leaves us off on a beat where we could have ended and I would have been satisfied, but thematically I think it needs to keep pushing and come to a better realization within the characters that maybe what they're doing for the wrong reasons, or what they thought was the end game is still a long ways down the road. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you think of Dune Prophecy? And what are your predictions for season 2? As always, keep reading.